Hello, my name is Kaan Ünlü from University, and I'm here to present you the tool we have created together with the members of Bilkent University, Eray, Tüzün, and Barış Ardıç, in the tool we'd like to call Code Review Series Game. So let's begin. Before getting into the game proper, let's talk a bit about code review. Code review is the process of quality assurance for a particular piece of code. And after this, it should be obvious why the teaching of code review is important in multiple different environments. It is important for individual learning, because if you're an independent developer, you want to keep your code in top shape. It will be important in professional learning, such as during orientation sessions for new employees, because you want your employees to keep your code neat, and for educational purposes, because at schools, you want your students to learn how to code properly and review code properly as early as possible. With this information in mind, let's get into the premise of the game. So this is a serious game about code review based on the principles of game design and code review education, which we have touched on in previous research. It is overall an HCI study about the importance of ease of use in serious games. This is the work pipeline of the development process that we went through. The short of it is, first we conducted some research on the subject, then we crafted a prototype. Then we overhauled the prototype using the feedback we got internally and externally. And after that, we did some experimentation based on the final product we had in hand and planned what features could be implemented in the future. In the rest of this presentation, we'll be talking about some of the interesting design elements we've implemented during this process and the experiment that we have conducted. So how did we design the game? We had a tutorial, a practice level, and 4 actual game levels. The tutorial level explains what code smells are with examples. The practice level is an interactive manual teaching the game's mechanics, and the game levels are larger code segments with numerous code defects planted in them, and the main game mechanic surrounds the player trying to find these numerous code defects in each and every level. This is the expected game flow we had in mind. When a player enters any particular level, they are greeted by what we call, and will describe later, as Stella. They can listen to their advice about the code review ethic, and then they can start working on the level itself. The level includes a large code segment with a number of code defects embedded into it. The player is expected to find each and every one of these defects and find the reason why these certain code bits are defects. And when they're satisfied with their defect list, they're supposed to submit their choices and see their score. If they're not happy with the score, they can try and see whether they have missed any defects in the code. If they're stuck, they can use the checklist or the hints that are offered to them per level to see if they're missing anything with their process. If they're having problems identifying what kind of defect a piece of problematic code is, they can check the guide. With the basics of the game design and expected flow in mind, let's look at certain aspects of the design, zoom in, and try to see some interesting bits. We have used the phrase emotional palette based on Genova Chen's explanation of the term in his GDC talk about designing the game journey. And to create an emotional palette for the game, we took Star Trek as an example. So what is this emotional palette, you say? Emotional palette is what kind of emotion playing the game incites in the player. And we wanted this emotional palette to be one of exploration with the theme of space travel. To make the theme come true, we decided to create a persona for the game. We called her Stella. She is designed to pull the players into the planned theme with interactivity beyond just usuals. And her actual function in the game is giving tidbits about code review ethic, usually, and some mechanics of the game, and also narrating the story content. This is Stella's model as she is seen in game. As you can see, we tried to keep this like a dialogue box you could see in most dialogue heavy games, and to keep Stella's face emotive despite being a masked astronaut, we reflected some emotive elements to her face, such as a smiley or some exclamation marks or some question marks. Another thing we can highlight in our design process is the attention we gave to progress feedback. Despite the game being built on a browser-based environment, which limits a lot of the progress feedback you can expect, from other kinds of media. We've aimed for visual responsiveness for UI elements, which means anything that can be selected is supposed to be made obvious to be as so, and aim to feel good to click. And mechanically, we have created various sources of helps and hints to help the player with their progress, to see what kind of actions they can take, or what kind of actions they should take for a good review session. Talking about the UI components and their feedback, we have emphasized the style of the UI to support the sci-fi theme. And we have also given utmost attention to make the information given in the UI to be neither barren nor overwhelming. And we used the guidance that was given by Pablo Alonso in his development guide in the Warframe forums. This is the main menu of the game. Here the player can, by clicking the log button, see what Stella's objective is, and they can, by scrolling across the map, see different levels they can go to. To keep with the sci-fi feel of the game, we made it so that every single level is a different space station that can be fixed before Stella can move on. We've also made it so that the mouse pointer is a spaceship, so that the player knows that this is supposed to be a kind of simulation of what the Stella character is going through. Since this is a series game and ultimately tries to teach its players how to code review in a better way, we have given a lot of attention in creating the tutorial as well. The tutorial is made to ameliorate the steep learning curve of code review, with 10 different code segments, each with a distinctly different code defect in it, and the players are allowed to go back and forth between the defects and their solutions. Here, as you can see, the player can see a code segment and they're allowed to try and look for a defect in the code segment. They can see the defect, they can go back to the solution, and the explanations are given both as visual styles and color coordination. We talked about the in-game helpers before, the hints and the guides that we use to allow the player to track their progress in the game. So how do they work? These helpers are made to smooth the learning process inside the game rather than prior to it, because the player is allowed to see these guides during a game level instead of going back to the tutorial and trying to find the thing from scratch. What we have is a guide to defects, a checklist of what to do during a review, a button to show the answers of the level with explanations for each defect in the level, and a practice level to teach the player the mechanics of the game. This is a showcase of one of the levels from within the game. To the right you can see the code segment. This is where the code defects are going to. When you find a code defect, you're supposed to highlight it with your cursor, and then, using the left side of the screen, mark that part of the code as a defect. Then, using the selector menu on this new selection you have made, you will have to choose what kind of defect these lines you have chosen are supposed to be. If you're having any troubles, you can see the checklist to see the list of things you are supposed to do in order while reviewing code. Or, if you're having trouble with something specific to the level, you can click a hint. If you're not sure what kind of defect the lines you have selected are, you can use the guide to find a comprehensive list of all defect types and an explanation of what these defect types are. If, after trying multiple times, you believe you still have not found all the answers, you can click See Answers, and that will give you all of the correct answers in this level and explanations for them. And so these were the design highlights that we wanted to show you before setting into the implementation approach we followed while building the game. The front end of this is the level design philosophy, in which we decided to make the levels harder step by step to allow the player to grow together with it and not feel overwhelmed as they first step into the game. The earlier levels, therefore, are more likely to have more physically obvious defects, indentation errors, long lines, etc., to make even newcomers easily be able to spot these problems. However, in the later levels, the players are more likely to have defects that require critical thinking and mastery over the used language. Players have to see logical problems, and they have to see problems that are specific to language, complicated pointer problems, etc. And then there's the back end of our implementation approach, which is that we develop the game on a web-based environment. So the game runs on the client side of any browser, which increases the game's accessibility as there is no installation needed. For different player accounts, we use Google's Firebase cloud service to authenticate these accounts and keep their data safe. And we develop the game without using any web frameworks, so that third parties after the release can get their hands on the game and change aspects of the game, such as add new levels, or change the used programming language for the levels easily without having to learn how to use different web frameworks. And of course, we have conducted tests to see how well the game has performed under different kinds of player bases. We actually plan to make it so that we can conduct multiple code review related lab sessions with this, but COVID-19 quarantine caused these lab sessions to be held online instead, which turned the situations into subpar variants of their planned selves. But in the end, we did indeed have video conference based sessions of 52 and 80 students respectively, and each of these two different groups had different mastery over the subject of code review. In average, we extracted from the data the overall enjoyment of different components of the game we have constructed and that we have looked over during the design highlights. Most of the components have been lagged quite a lot, and the only small difference we see in these ratings is when we look at Stella, which was not enjoyed thoroughly by most players because they thought she was not very useful. So let's take a final look at what we have done and what we are looking forward to in the future. Code Review Series Game is a series game that aims to teach code review related practices, and we used game design principles to make the learning process more engaging, and kept the code base evolvable to allow teachers to tailor their teaching experience to their wishes. Most of the components are successfully keeping the students on task, but Stella needs further work. And what new content we plan for the future? There are two things that we are planning for future editions. These are multiplayer game modes. One incorporates the role of the author into the game flow to better represent the code review workflows. So there's the code author, and then there's the reviewer. And when the reviewer is reviewing their code, they are giving feedback to the author. We are trying to find a way to incorporate that into the game. Another way of trying to put up new content for the game is creating a cooperative mode allowing players to conduct code reviews as a group, so multiple players, multiple reviewers reviewing the same piece of code. And so this was Code Review Series Game. Thank you for listening and have a beautiful day.